Welcome to the Samvidhan Divas special on Beyond Boundaries. Beyond Boundaries is a series of virtual sessions initiated by Takshila Educational Society to further ideas that foster learning, self-expression, and ingenuity. We at Takshila are keen on connecting young minds to an unbound range of themes, thoughts, and perspectives that facilitate their understanding of the world and its concerns. These sessions bring articulate speakers from the world of art, education, literature, science, development, and beyond to engage your time and mind. In this session, titled Contemporary Relevance of the Preamble to the Indian Constitution, our speaker, Mr. Arvind Narrain, explores the origin of core preambular values and their significance in contemporary India. Mr. Narrain is a lawyer based in Bangalore who is involved with research, writing, and advocacy on human rights issues. He is a founding member of the Alternative Law Forum and a visiting faculty at the School of Policy and Governance at the Azim Premji University. Mr. Narrain holds bachelor's in law from National Law School of India University, Bangalore, master's in law and development from University of Warwick, and is currently pursuing his doctorate at the NLSIU. He has 3 published titles to his name: Law Like Love, Queer Perspectives in Law, Breathing Life into the Constitution, Human Rights Lawyering in India, and the Preamble, A Brief Introduction. He has taught numerous law courses at the NLSIU. In addition to being part of many fact-founding reports on sexual minorities in India, Mr. Narrain was in the litigation team which argued the constitutionality of IPC Section 377 before the High Court and the Supreme Court. Over to Mr. Arvind Narrain. Sir, please. Over to Mr. Arvind Narrain. Sir, please.
Thank you, Akshat, and thank you for the invitation. I think the occasion of Samvidhan Divas, or the day to mark the final text, the adoption of the Indian Constitution, is an important one, and I'm very, very pleased that you all have organized this particular event. And I think I was asked to look at the significance of the preamble of the Indian Constitution, and I'll put it this way. Sometimes we think constitutions are texts which are owned by lawyers. And what you all have done by organizing this event is to indicate that there is a wider ownership to something called the Constitution. And I was wondered whether you thought about why that was so. Why do you think that there's a deeper or wider ownership to the Constitution than merely lawyers? And I think part of the answer lies in the way we think of the Constitution, or the way we understand the Constitution. Of course, it's a legal document, but I think the important point which we need to think of is we have to see the Constitution as a product of a struggle. As one of our senior counsel, Mr. Kanabiran, put it, he said the Constitution is like poetry, emotion recollected in tranquility. And what he meant by using that kind of a metaphor is to indicate that the importance or the value of the Constitution comes from the fact that it is born out of a struggle against both social inequality, economic inequality, and political inequality. So if you think of the Constitution, we think of the Constitution as really emerging out of a more wide-ranging movement. If you can think of, for example, words which capture the intensity, this is Nehru's phrasing, the way he puts it during the adoption of the objectives resolution, he says words are magic things often enough, but sometimes the magic of words cannot capture the intensity of a nation's passion. By which he meant that when we look at the Constitution, we don't look at it as lawyers do, as dull, lifeless words. We look at the words as imbued with a certain context and imbued with a certain meaning which struggle has given it. So in a sense, what I'm trying to do in the course of this, the time that we have together, is to try and put forward to you what is the nature of the struggle that resulted in the words of the Constitution and the words of the preamble in particular, And why are those words so meaningful to us today? One, of course, is you look at it as a product of a struggle, therefore it's meaningful. But I think the important point about a constitution is its language speaks, kind of emerges from a certain history of the past, but also speaks to the future. And that is the significance of a constitutional text. A constitution is not a law which is made, which applies to that particular grouping, but it's meant, in a sense, to bind or to apply to future generations as well. If it's meant to apply to future generations, Akshat, since you're a future generation that meant to apply to your generation, then obviously the understanding must be there must be something in the language which speaks to your generation as well, right? And hopefully, in the course of what I'm trying to communicate, something in that language will speak to your generation as well. I'll start by saying that, if you look at one of the three fundamental, I want to look at three fundamental ideas which underlie the preamble. One is the idea of political freedom. Second is the idea of social freedom. Third is the idea of economic freedom. Uh, if you look at political freedom as a concept, again, when we think of Mahatma Gandhi, we often think of him in the context, many contexts. We think of him, of course, as the father of the nation. Once you get to a certain level of, conversance with what is with the politics around that moment in time, then you'll realize that there was a big debate which he had with Dr. Ambedkar on the question of caste, right? And often today, and I think rightly so, we see Gandhiji as being wrong as far as the debate was concerned. Ambedkar was in the right as far as the debate is concerned. But the point which is deeply significant, I think about Gandhiji's contribution is really his understanding of what political freedom meant. I want to just take you to things which he said, right? If there's one person who's deeply committed to the idea of political freedom, it was Gandhiji. I'll just read out to you some things of what he said. He said that civil liberties, consistent with the observance of non-violence, is the first step towards Swaraj. It is the breadth of political and social life. It is the foundation of freedom. There's no room there for dilution or compromise. It is the water of life. Right? So somebody who felt that's significant, it's deeply important. And what does this political freedom mean? Again, see the way he puts it. He says we must first make good the right of free speech and free association before we can make any further progress towards our goal, which is independence. We must defend these elementary rights with our lives. Liberty of speech means that it is unassailed even when the speech hurts. Liberty of the press can be said to be truly respected only when the press can comment in the severest terms upon an even misrepresent matters. Freedom of association is truly respected, but assemblies of people can discuss even revolutionary projects. Three important ideas which Gandhiji is highlighting: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and freedom of association. So there's a way in which these are, as he says, the water of life. Without these, you have nothing at all. I mean, and so I was thinking of this and said, wow, we have to think of Gandhi as the exemplar of the ideal of political freedom in the constitution. And again, when it came to Gandhiji, words were not just words. Words was something which were imbued with action. I'll give you an example of something which I think, if you get a chance, all of you must go back and read this particular transcript. In 1922, Gandhiji tried for sedition by a court in Gujarat. And sedition, if you know by now, the offense of sedition is defined as exciting disaffection against the state. Again, against the government established by law. Again, you can ask me, what is disaffection? Such a quaint English word. We know affection. If I have affection for you, understand that. If I have disaffection for you, what on earth does that mean? And the answer is, I mean, we'll get to the answer, but he was tried for disaffection, exciting disaffection against the government established by law, which is the definition of sedition. Why was he tried for sedition? Because he wrote a series of articles which were deeply critical of the then British government, right? And he was critical of their ability to rule and of the fact that they were ruling India and the kind of atrocities that they perpetrated during the rule. And he going on to talk about sedition. He's being tried for sedition, right? And he says sedition has become the creed of the Congress. Every non-cooperator is pledged to preach disaffection through the government established by law. Non-cooperation, though a religious and strictly moral movement, deliberately aims at the overthrow of the government and is therefore legally seditious in terms of the Indian Penal Code. Right? So there's a way in which it says that it's my duty to be seditious. Because the government is so immoral, so lacking in any sense of any connection to justice, that I can do nothing but be seditious. And then he goes on to say in another article, he says, we're challenging the might of this government because we consider its activity to be wholly evil. We want to overthrow the government. We want to compel its submission to the people's will. We desire to show that the government exists to serve the people, not the people, the government. So you can imagine what happens. You write stuff like this, even in today's context or in that day's context, the governments don't like it. So that's the basis on which he was tried for sedition. And again, think of this, imagine this as a courtroom context. When you're tried for a particular criminal offense, and if you have at some point in time, if you have the privilege of standing up in court as an accused person, accused of sedition, right? The prosecutor, the judge will ask you one question: that do you agree to the fact that you committed this particular offense? And lawyers will give you the answer that there's only one answer you give. They say, no, my lord, I plead not guilty, which means then the trial proceeds on the basis that you contest at every level the factual context of the charge against you. Give you one background context to this. It's very interesting that sedition was a law which the British colonialists used against the Indian independence movement. The precursor to Gandhi, against whom the law of sedition was used, was Tilak. And interestingly enough, when it was used against Tilak, the person who defended Tilak at the time was Jinnah. And Jinnah's argument was a very good lawyer's argument. He said that, that the sedition is exciting disaffection against the government established by law. It's not just the government. It's not the government of the day. It's the government established by law, which means there must be some sense of a constancy or some sense of a deeper rooting to that particular government. So he says, you're not a government established by law, you're merely the government of the day. And that was the technical legal argument he used to try to get Tilak released on the charge of sedition. But Gandhi's approach was very different. He said, yes, I plead guilty. I've committed this offense. And I want to tell you now why I'm committing the offense of sedition against you. And in a brilliant speech, which again, it's available in the collected work of Gandhi, and it's only 2 pages long, it's totally worth reading. The point he makes, again, links up to a question of social, economic, and political justice. If you say the preamble talks about the justice, social, economic, and political. That speech is about justice, economic, and political for sure, and potentially social as well. Definitely political justice and economic justice. Because the point he's making, he says, I began my career in the colonies in South Africa as a staunch supporter of the British government. Today, I'm a staunch disaffectionist. Why is that so? I will tell you why that is so. He says, from the beginning, we dealt with Indians as second-class citizens. In South Africa, I realized that when you came to India, and then you look at, for example, in particular, look at the Rowlatt Act, which basically denies Indians the right to bail, the right to appearance before a court, and the right to appeal. That's a kind of a draconian law. That's a denial of justice in a basic kind of way. Then you look at the range of ways in post Jallianwala Bagh, where the law has been used to criminalize Indians. Then you see the question of the second-class citizenship, which you're imposing on the Indian population. And on the economic context, he says you go to the villages in India, you'll see people reduced to the stage of almost being skeletons. And he says those skeletons don't lie. They tell you that your economic policy is the biggest disaster which has been inflicted upon this particular country. So he says, puts all these kind of, here's this man being tried for sedition. And what he's doing, he's producing a charge sheet over the British have done. He's saying you are guilty of these forms of injustice, right? And as interestingly enough, as observers there say, that Gandhi the way he conducted the sedition trial, instead of being the guilty, instead of being the accused, he put the state on trial. The rebel put the state on trial, saying that you are not conformed to the laws of humanity. You are not conformed to the principles of justice. It's you who committed the offense, not me. That was the line he took. And he finally concluded, again getting to a sedition point, by a very interesting, very important point. He said, again, we started by referring to the fact that, what is sedition is exciting disaffection against the government established by law. And we said, what is disaffection? And Gandhi answers the question in a way. He says, affection cannot be manufactured or regulated by law. If one feels disaffected towards the government, one must be fully free to establish that disaffection, provided you do not use any violent means. Right? So he's in effect saying that, when the government uses the law like disaffection, you don't compel love by force. Love is something which comes out of my relationship to you. You should do something to make me love you. If you're unlovable, it's very difficult. I mean, you can't compel me to love you. Affection cannot be manufactured or regulated by law. And that's the fundamental point he makes in the sedition trial. So you get from Gandhi an exemplar of the idea, of the ideal of political freedom. And if you look at the preamble's words, it's the liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship. Those are the fundamental rudiments of what you call political freedom. And that's what Gandhi stood for, right? And so in a sense, right, if you have the use of sedition laws, which are used by a government to clamp down on criticism, I think the point to make to them is this is not in line with the freedoms that we've got through the Constitution. The Constitution embodies a certain kind of struggle. It embodies a certain kind of result which comes out of the struggle. And that result is a respect for the idea of political freedom and the liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship. And I just make one last point on the question of political freedom, which is, if you look at the judgments of the Supreme Court, right, on the sedition question, again, the Supreme Court is very clear. That I'll give you an example, that when you say sedition, and it's exciting disaffection against the government established by law, even going by the term, even assuming that the terms are there, Supreme Court says that it must be accompanied by the incitement to violence. Mere words by themselves do not amount to sedition. A Facebook post here, a Facebook post there, which people might object to it, don't constitute sedition. Sedition must imply that your post leads to or has the possibility of leading to the threat of imminent lawless violence. If that is not there, it doesn't amount to sedition. I'll give you one example on this. After Indira Gandhi's assassination, there was a case filed against a couple of Sikhs who were celebrating and who shouted slogans called Khalistan Zindabad. And of course, as things would go, a case of sedition was filed against them. The case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says the words might be problematic, but they don't incite any form of violence. The stray words put forward by a couple of people. And there's no sense in any way in which the government established by law is threatened. So we don't count that. We don't see that as sedition. Right? So there's a certain understanding of what your ideal of political freedom is. This, of course, the ideal is something which is an ideal level. I'm just putting forward as saying this is some of the ideas in the preamble or ideals in the preamble, which we want to protect, preserve, and defend. If you're saying Constitution Day, it should be fundamentally about really protecting the right to speech, expression, association, and which is what in a sense Gandhi stood for. So I'll just make that point on political freedom and leave it at that. I want to get to the next point, which is the idea of what you call social freedom. Again, it's an interesting point, right? What do you mean by social freedom? And here we have to get to the fact that the complicated scenario of what kind of a country India is, right? And here, I think when we refer to Gandhi in terms of political freedom, in refer to social freedom, you have to begin by saying that the theorist or the thinker about social freedom in the Indian context is Dr. Ambedkar, is Baba Saheb Ambedkar. And why is he the thinker on this point? Because when you think of political freedom, you often think of it as, a freedom for somebody out there. Somebody out there is oppressing you. You get rid of the oppressor, and then you are fine. What the ideal of social freedom tells you is that society sometimes is the problem. Sometimes your right to freedom is constrained not by the state, but by society. And society is from whom you need that sense of a freedom, right? And this is a point which activists with respect to gender, activists with respect to sexuality, activists with respect to caste will make this point repeatedly. I'll just go down to what Ambedkar said a little bit more and say, why is he such a significant thinker on this point? Uh, Give you an example, maybe the starting point of an articulation of the idea of social freedom. If in political freedom we go back to Gandhi and the Sedition trial, for social freedom, I'd say we'll go back to Ambedkar and what is referred to as the Mahad Satyagraha. The Mahad Satyagraha was basically a satyagraha launched by Dr. Ambedkar, which was basically a movement for the then untouchable communities to drink water from a tank called Chavdar tank. Again, the story goes like this, that if you know anything about India, one thing you should know is that the caste system prevails in the Indian social context. And if the caste system prevails, it means that there's a social hierarchy or social division, including, for example, with respect to access to drinking water. Access to drinking water, you go to any village, is still today is divided on lines of caste. The Dalit communities have their water source, the upper caste communities have the water source, and the two can't mix together, as it were. And as Chavdar Tank, the description which Ambedkar gives us is this, that in Chavdar Tank, uh, the upper caste drink that water. They don't mind crows, they don't mind cattle drinking the water, but they will not tolerate the Dalit communities drinking that same water. So what Ambedkar did is he marched at the head of a delegation. They went to Chowdhury tank and drank the water of that tank. And there's a beautiful speech which he gives there, which is totally worth reading. Again, if you're reading the sedition speech by Gandhi, you should also read the speech on the Mahad Satyagraha by Ambedkar. And the point he makes there, again, beautifully, is he says, see, we're drinking this water not because water is an exceptional quality. We're drinking this water to assert our right to equality like everybody else. Right? And so the point he's making is that this is as significant a move in the Indian context as the taking of the oath on the tennis court in France during the which set off the French Revolution. He says this is the revolution of our day, which is going to the Mad district and drinking the water from Chowdhury tank. And why is it such a significant thing? Because we're signaling a determination to what he calls breaking the steel frame of the caste system, right? So you get that commitment to the issue of social freedom. Okay, this is the struggle. Again, my point is this way. This is the struggle which I'm referring to. The struggle for equality in social matters articulated by Ambedkar. The struggle for dignity articulated by Ambedkar. Where does it find a place in the preamble? That's the question. I'm trying to give you a sense of what is the life underlying the concepts in the preamble. And perhaps the most meaningful concept in the preamble from the point of view of Dr. Ambedkar's articulation is really the notion of dignity. If you look at the Constitution, it says fraternity assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. What does the word dignity mean, right? And dignity is the other humiliation. Dignity, in a sense, is the quality which captures the sense of being human. What it is to be human is communicated to you by the notion of dignity. Dignity includes your right to be treated as equal as everybody else. It includes your right to make choices about your personal, intimate life. It includes your right to humanity as equal as anybody else, right? And so, dignity, if you think of it as why is it in the constitutional framework, and you get a sense that the heart of dignity really comes from the struggle against caste domination. Because what is caste domination if not a constant sense of humiliation, ostracism, and setting people aside, saying that you don't belong, you're not equal to us, right? And that sense of humiliation is what you fight against when you articulate the notion or the idea of dignity. Equally, if you look at the idea of equality in the Constitution, it's very interesting. Look at Article, again, when you get to reading the Constitution in terms of the text, if you look at Article 15.2, it says every citizen is entitled to access to places of public accommodation, including water bodies, wells, tanks, bathing gardens, etc., without discrimination on grounds such as caste, uh, gender, race, place of birth. You think of this again, you think of it as a completely colorless provision. Who cares about access to water bodies, right? But then if you get the sense of the history underlying the struggle, you say it's one of the most meaningful concepts you have in the Constitution. The Constitution, in a sense, speaking to people around the country, in villages around the country, saying that you have an equal right to access water bodies and places of public accommodation and shops in your particular social setting. So I guess what I'm trying to say is you try and look at the historical context in which concepts emerge. And the reason I make the important point, again, maybe I'll link this up here as well, is the important point here is not just about where a concept originates, but how the concept speaks to the future. Let's take dignity as an example. Dignity, in its origin points, the way we have understood it, comes from the context of caste discrimination. If you read in particular a book by Akash Singh Rathore called Ambedkar's Preamble, he makes the point that the word dignity enters the Indian Constitution because of Ambedkar's insistence that it be there. That's the context in which it emerges. Is that the context in which it is limited? And that's the important thing about the idea of law and about the idea of how a certain language can not just speak to the present, can also speak to the future. By which I mean, I'll give you this example. How has the Supreme Court understood the idea of dignity? Give you a couple of examples. There's one case which was filed where a person, Prem Shankar Jha, was subjected to solitary confinement in prison. And the Supreme Court held that, by way of imprisonment, it doesn't mean you lose all your constitutional rights. Of course, you lose your right to movement. There might be a certain narrowing of other rights. But fundamentally, you don't lose your right to dignity. And that means that solitary confinement is a violation of right to dignity because human beings are by nature social beings. If you put them in a place where they have no interaction with anybody else, then you're fundamentally violating what it means to be human. Because to be human is to be social, to interact with other people. You can't cut that out, And that is a violation of right to dignity. So that's one way in which the word dignity was understood, taken forward. And that speaks to a future which may not have been contemplated the time it was drafted, but it spoke to the future because of the way it was interpreted at a future point in time. I'll give you one more example of the way dignity has been understood. Today, dignity is also understood as your right to intimate choice. By intimate choice, I mean your choice to be with the person that you love, right? And that could be across lines of caste, could be across lines of religion, could be across lines of gender and sexuality. I'll give you one example on this. In 2019, the Supreme Court struck down Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes what it calls carnal intercourse against the order of nature and is a form of discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons. And the court held law violates your right to dignity. And again, how did they come to this conclusion? They came to this conclusion by using this kind of a language. Their point is that when you have a law which criminalizes your right to make choices about who you choose to love, that is an intrusion to a realm of intimate decision making and is a violation of your right to dignity. Again, the reason I went so strongly or so fully into dignity is to indicate that a law which originates or a concept which originates in the Constituent Assembly debates, which may not at that moment in time are meant to speak to a range of other contexts, today speaks to many, many contexts. So in a sense, the imperative of struggle is how do you make these concepts speak to a contemporary context? What are the contemporary concerns which Akshat you might have in your life, right? What are the concepts in the constituent in the preamble we can speak to your contemporary concerns? And I think the only way we make the Constitution a live document is by making the Constitution speak to contemporary concerns. I'll make one more point in terms of, which links up again, starting from Ambedkar and social freedom, is the entire notion of fraternity. Again, you go down the constitution, go to the Constitution. We understood what liberty means. In some ways, we've spoken about what equality means. And the third term in that is fraternity. And what does fraternity mean? And again, the point about fraternity is it's seen as the stepsister in this trinity of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Most people don't understand what it means or why it's there in the Constitution or the preamble itself. And again, you go back to the drafting. Fraternity is there because Dr. Ambedkar insisted that it be there. And his point was he said that liberty and equality without fraternity will be no deeper than a coat of paint. By which he meant that unless you have a sense of fellow feeling, which cuts across lines of caste and religion, this notion of liberty and equality is fairly meaningless. Unless you have the sense of a oneness of a social body, which cuts across these deep divisions. And the point again, you go down. Again, it's interesting that in his other work, if you go back to his work, Annihilation of Caste, one point he makes about how do you annihilate caste. One point, not the only point, but one point he makes is one way of annihilating caste is when the way he phrases it, when blood begins to mix with blood, by which he means intercaste marriage or intercaste relationships are one way of in which you foster a sense of intimacy, in which you question the politics of separation and the politics that that you see the other as someone who's distant, someone you can't connect with. You break through those lines. Again, in the India of today, when you have, for example, laws which prohibit love across lines of religion or lines of caste, then you go back to Ambedkar, you go back to the preambular promise and say that if fraternity is what we want to safeguard, then we have to say that laws which prohibit you from marrying across lines of caste or religion, or social norms which prohibit you from marrying across norms of caste or religion, are fundamentally at odds with the principle of fraternity, which is an integral part of the Indian constitutional framework. Yeah. So that's the second idea. So I'll just make one more point on social freedom, which is a very important point actually. Again, you go back to Ambedkar's work. He says this very, very, very powerful and very, very strongly. He says that, of course, he says slightly tongue-in-cheek, so treat it in that particular way. He says, see, sometimes it's not that difficult to be a fighter for political freedom, because end of the day, you might be in jail, but you have your entire society behind you. The entire people is united behind you. You are a hero as far as the people are concerned, and you're fighting in this context of the British. But he says the far more difficult thing is to be a fighter for social freedom. Because if you're a fighter for social freedom, you're against your society. You're alone in that battle. Right? So just keep that in mind that there are many kinds of struggles. The political struggle is one struggle. It's a significant and very, very important struggle. Equally important is the social struggle. And the social struggle in the Indian context today is really against the norms which bind us on grounds of grounds of caste, on grounds of religion, on grounds of gender, and on grounds of sexuality. Right? And so that these battles sometimes are far more intimate and far more difficult, but it's a very important part of the battle as well, which is the struggle for social freedom. And perhaps I'll make one last point, and then we'll end up with that, which is I said we look at political freedom, we look at social freedom, and we look at economic freedom. Economic freedom is perhaps this is a question of debate. I'm sure there will be many people have many opinions on this, but in my own opinion, I think the idea of economic freedom in the Constituent Assembly or in the preamble is deferred to a future date. There's not the same sense of a detail on economic freedom as there is on social freedom, as there is in political freedom. Why I say this is because if you look at the world today, right? And again, here, if anybody gets a chance, I'd urge you to read a book by Thomas Piketty called Capital and Ideology. The point he's making is a very, very important, very, very interesting point. He says the world today is the most unequal it's ever been. And he says the kinds of inequality, economic inequality we have in the world today, is really reminiscent of the world just after the French Revolution. 1789, French Revolution. After that, you had what the French call the Belle Epoque, which is the most unequal period in the history of the world. And where did that world end up in? High levels of inequality, which were unsustainable, which led, in Piketty's analysis, to World War One and then to World War Two. Right? So, in a sense, it's a very interesting point. Even the French Revolution, with its deep significance for the idea of equality, was not able to deal fundamentally with the question of economic inequality. That's the point Piketty is throwing up before us. So, in a similar sense, look at the Indian constitutional framework. Arguably, the Indian constitutional framework has not been successful in addressing the question of economic inequality. And it may be one of the most significant questions we face because it's economic inequality which leads, in a sense, to social tensions, which is the argument which Piketty is making with respect to post-World War, post the French Revolution. Why did Hitler come to power? Why did the range of authoritarians come to power at that moment in time? Because they were able to capitalize on a sense of frustration, which was born out of lack of enough economic opportunities of employment, as far as large majority of people are concerned. If today we're in a similar place of high levels of inequality, then the concerns are very similar. You're saying that today economic inequality is a structure which can really blow up the entire framework called the Indian Constitution. And so that's something which I think we need to keep in mind and think about in the time going forward. How do you deal with the question of economic inequality? Again, Piketty's point is a very important one. It's the analysis of what he calls the 1% and the 10%. If you look at the amount of income which is being earned, it's something ridiculous figures, such as 10% of the world's population earns more money than 55% of the world's population. Right? So it's a very, very small segment which is monopolizing most of the gains. And if you look at the figures which Oxfam came forward with respect to even post the pandemic, you've seen the figures there, that during the pandemic, when large majority of people lost jobs and the economic situation became even more difficult, the billionaires in India made much more money, right? So all of this indicates that, there's something fundamentally wrong with the world. Again, maybe the other linking point to look at is Amitav Ghosh's recent work, which is called The Curse of the Nutmeg, where you look at the question of climate change. Look at the question of how climate change is linked up to economic inequality, linked up to certain model of development. And that's another significant dimension. Of course, for the future generations, we have to look at the issue of climate change and how, for example, the world is being changed dramatically, transformed by a certain model of capitalist development, which not only leading inequality, but also leading to a certain kind of a commodification of the world at large, of the inanimate world at large, and producing all kinds of phenomena which are making life unsustainable, not just for mankind, but for a range of living species as well. So these are some of the challenges we face. But I think the point I want to make, I'll end with one last point, is that since we're addressing a range of, since we're speaking to a range of younger people, really, is that I think what you need to have is a certain sense of, I think, optimism and a certain sense of a lack of cynicism, right? Whatever else happens, as young people, you should not be cynical. You should see what is it that one can do to change the world. You identify the problems. How do you go about changing the world or transforming the world in a certain direction, which is more in line with the constitutional precepts of justice, of liberty, of equality, and dignity? I'll just end with that. And thank you for your patient hearing.